Hey folks, I am Will, and here to chat a little bit about adopting LLMs in your product. I'm currently the CTO of Carta, and I've worked a handful of other places as well. Written a handful of books, most recently Engineering Executives Primer with O'Reilly that came out in February. I think it's worth a read. 2024 has really been just like this endless pop quiz about LLMs. I think any meeting you go into, whether it's a board meeting, whether it's a product planning meeting, whether it's just a meeting with other peers, the topic of LLMs is very likely to pop up. And one of the things I've been realizing more and more as I get into this is that there are so many really appealing mental models about LLMs that are also pretty flawed. And two of the most common ones that I've run into are the first, just LLMs are straight magic. It's not a technique. You simply apply LLMs and get the outcome you want. And it could be, no matter what you want. Kind of the theory here is that if you just add LLMs, you'll get that thing. This is a super unhelpful mental model because anyone who says something can't be done or there's a better technique is just sort of wrong. But you see it quite frequently with folks who are a little bit further away from technology itself. Another one is that LLMs are just the same as reinforcement learning. And so you have, a couple of generations of leadership, typically not engineering, like one step removed, and say product, business, whatnot, who have a pretty good mental model of how kind of the previous ML techniques around reinforcement learning work. And so they know things like, hey, before we have much data, that the accuracy is going to be low. But as we improve the size of the data set, we keep retraining, we improve precision and recall, and eventually we're going to get something really good. So even if like the first iteration is like not super accurate, it's going to get very accurate over time as our data set increases in size. So the first kind of peaks of LLM behavior we're seeing today, those are obviously bad, and they're obviously going to improve in this like very predictable linear fashion. And both of these flawed mental models, and they're certainly not the only ones, but they're two that I'm seeing pretty frequently, are showing up everywhere. And if you go into the board meeting, you're going to hear questions about why haven't you replaced your team, or why haven't you completely reworked part of your product to do something magical yet with LLMs. Vendors are certainly banging on the door, talking about how LLMs are going to replace your team, how they're going to do kind of impossible things. It's like finally know your internal knowledge base for the very first time. LLMs will bust open the door. It's gonna be magical. And you can never forget influencers. God bless the influencers. They're out there telling us that if we've even hired engineers at all, we're doing something incredibly dumb. And the thing is, there's all these people trying to sell you various things. Like your board wants you to buy products from the next generation of companies they've invested in. Vendors want you to buy products from them. Influencers want you to buy a course or something from them. So none of them are actually super helpful for figuring out how you should adopt LLMs in your product, but there still is like a real need for you to figure out how to adopt. And there's a real potential that this is like the next technology state change or sea change for us, right? So you see like mobile and like the 07-ish era, and now crypto wanted to be that, but probably hasn't really made that transition. Maybe it's LLMs. So what should you do to actually accommodate this potential transition into your product? So I want to talk about 8 pillars that I found pretty useful for adopting LLMs. I want to talk a little bit about how Carta has adopted LLMs. And I just want to add some additional caveats from the stuff that I've learned along the way. And just to be really clear, there's sort of 3 categories you could think about in terms of like adopting or deploying LLMs at your company. Productivity tooling for engineers, like Copilot for non-engineers or everyone, including engineers, but also other folks at your company, things like Glean, which is kind of a knowledge-based retrieval or discovery tool. I'm not really talking about those. Like my take is that whether you're using an LLM or not is actually not that interesting. These are just like tools, and either the tools help you accomplish a goal or they don't. But the fact that there's an LLM in them is just marketing, and so I wouldn't worry too much about that. I would just assess these as tools. Is it a problem you care about? Does it solve that problem? How well does it solve the problem? Is that at a reasonable price? Everything else I would ignore. I'd do a trial run in every category. I wouldn't think about it too much more deeply than that, though. The third category is where I really want to talk, is extending your company's product. And that, I think, is the particularly interesting question to think about. So let's jump into 8 pillars for building a useful mental model about LLMs in your product. First, LLMs are going to generate a reasonable response to any prompt, and so that's just flat out true. There is no prompt they won't try to give a reasonable answer to. And so here's one that I tried, which is basically, should I perform a reorg? And of course, the challenge with this prompt is that it's a terrible question, right? And if you mentor folks, you probably have mentored someone who's going to ask you a question like this. Should I quit my job? Should I get a new job? Should I perform a reorg? There's so much additional context you need to try to answer that question. There's no possible way to give a good answer to this question. And the challenge is, in this case, you are asking an LLM to give a good answer to a terrible question, and there's just no way for it to do it. And so this is the first pillar, is that in most cases you actually need to constrain the quality of a question to get a good response. Here, if you aren't doing that, or if you're letting your users directly generate prompts, you're going to get answers, just really bad ones, to really bad questions. Second is that you can't know whether the response to a new question is accurate or a hallucination. Basically a response that seems to make sense but doesn't. So when I was first playing around with ChatGPT a year and a half ago, whatnot, one of the questions I wanted to figure out is could it answer something that my wife asked about, which is that can you actually do a working hours function in Graphite? To figure that out, to have an alert only go off during working hours. It's actually a pretty nuanced problem, right? You need to know what the working hours are. You might have many different employees at a company, so there's different time zones. There's a whole lot of pieces to think about. And at the time, a year and a half ago, Graphite was glad to tell me there was a is working hours function. We just called it, gave me some really compelling evidence of how it worked, documentation of how I could use it as well. And of course, the only problem is there's absolutely no such function, and it's never existed at all. I recreated this experiment a couple weeks ago. And it's a little bit different in the sense that it no longer hallucinates this is working hours, but the answer it gives doesn't make any sense either. So it first is define what working hours are, which sure, I guess that's sort of part of the prompt. It's not really the important part of the prompt here. And then it tells you a bunch of Graphite functions, which this time these do exist, but they don't actually help you solve the problem at hand. And so this is a great example, really comprehensive, thorough answer. That the first time that just lied entirely, made up a function that doesn't exist, and the second time gave a ton of details that just actually aren't relevant to the problem at hand. And this is a great, this is the canonical hallucination moment where it seems right, it feels right, and it's just not right. And you just have to know that you're going to get answers like this. Product workflows matter a great deal as well. And so the first thing that you're going to have to do in terms of building, you're taking your existing product and making it work well with LLMs is probably to think about how workflows work. So imagine you're a mortgage broker, or people are coming in, they're applying for mortgages online, you need to review the information that's submitted. So a way that this product might have been designed, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, is people log in, they have all these fields they need to fill in with information about themselves, their employer, their working history, their salary, blah blah blah. And then someone internally to the company, basically a fraud reviewer, an analyst, an auditor, I don't know what the title would be, is going to ask for supporting documentation, then go through and verify these different fields that have been supplied by the person applying for the mortgage. And this is pretty annoying for the person applying for the mortgage. Basically, there's typing in a bunch of random stuff that's already in these documents. You don't feel super empowered in that moment. You're just kind of a gopher, like typing in stuff. The new model, you think about like how LLMs can really change how our products work. You log in, then if you ask for supporting documentation, then the LLM can extract the data from the documentation and present it back to a human in the loop. And that could be like multiple phases. Like first, you could show the data that you extracted to the person who's applying. Then you can take note of any fields that they override from what the model extracted. Those would be good places for you to look into internally to like validate the data coming in. But then you move your customer from this place of like keying in data manually to a place of reviewing data that you've extracted for them. It's a much more elevated place for them. It's a faster place for them. There's going to be fewer errors because yes, LLMs are going to make some errors. Again, that's why you need a human to review it. But humans make a lot of errors too, right? It's not like humans make no errors and LLMs make some errors. Like both humans and LLMs make errors to different extents. So then you have the customer kind of review the data that's been pulled out. You can flag some things that seem particularly unusual for them to review. And then once they approve that, internally you can still go through this review process, but instead of having to review everything, pulling the data out yourself with an internal kind of employee, you can just look at the places where either things kind of are unusual for some reason. You can have kind of like data validations. And you can look at places where the customer overrode like whatever that was extracted from the documents. And those two are going to give you like a really solid baseline for reviewing the data getting extracted. But like all of a sudden, like no one's actually extracting the data manually, and you've removed a tremendous amount of work from the workflow. And no longer do you have your customer do it, nor do you have your employee do it. That work's just gone, and that's pretty powerful. Only possible if you start reworking your product workflows though. And I think that every particularly interesting use case for an existing product that wants to adopt LLMs, if you aren't willing to like rework your workflows, I'm a little bit skeptical you're going to get something interesting out of it. But we'll see. You can you can't know if you're hallucinating or not, right? But you can use evals to evaluate the general accuracy of a given model for a style of prompts. So a good example of evals are this one. This is for the OpenAI evals repo, but basically talk about can you generate a SQL query from a human readable question. In this case, a question about horsepower for cars made in different countries, and so they have different questions like cars made in Europe, cars made in the US, cars made in Japan. And then it knows what answer it expects in terms of the SQL query, and then if it reruns it on new versions of the model or different models, it can determine like the accuracy of the model for the type of query you're doing. And this can be a useful way to just understand how performance is generally working for the type of problem you're working on. This matters not only because you want to like use newer models or something like that. It also matters because like a lot of the models people are using are in the cloud. And you're calling the same model, but the performance and behavior of that model might change over time. So certainly there have been accusations that certain OpenAI models have gotten lazier over time. And I don't know if that's true or false, but it's something people believe is true in some cases. And so having something like evals allows you to have an internal data set where you can understand like, is this actually improving or not? And certainly also folks have seen significant changes from the same model getting like new release updates over time. So these are really the bare minimum you need to be doing to understand how your product is working in production. You sort of imagine your product doesn't change after you deploy, but of course we know with third-party vendors, things do change after you deploy because you're working in a dynamic ecosystem. The same is certainly true for these foundational models. Models generally get more accurate as they get larger. So this is the chatbot arena, I believe, from Hugging Face. You can see arena ELO is kind of the fitness score for these different models. You can see that the highest scores are generally the largest models. So you can see like Claude 3 Opus beating out Claude 3 Sonnet, ChatGPT or GPT-4 scoring quite well. None of the 3.5s even on there anywhere. Generally, we see larger is better. but larger is also more expensive. So GPT-4 versus 3.5, about 10x more expensive. And even the fastest LLMs just aren't that fast. And so if we look at this chart, this is like a P50 chart. And you can see that, even for the fastest models, we're seeing about, 5 to 7 seconds of latency. And the latency is highly dependent on the context window as well. So if you have a much larger context window, it might be much slower. And something that we've experienced is in a lot of the real world kind of setups, you do the query, but you might need to do 2 or 3 follow-ups to get the full set of answers you want. So we talked about laziness earlier. We've seen some cases where we ask a model for the answer, then we ask again, and it continues the answer. There's stuff in the context window it didn't actually report on the first time. You even have to ask a second time, or a third time in aggregate. And this is just the reality of working with these tools right now. And that means that you might say, 5 seconds average, but a larger context window, maybe it's like 15 seconds. Maybe you have to do it 3 times. So all of a sudden you might be looking at like a whole minute of latency there. That's not that quick, particularly if you think about like an experience where a user is hanging around for a full minute, waiting for that to happen. And then finally, these things just aren't that expensive, particularly if you think about a B2B use case. If you are preparing taxes for a company, you need to prepare taxes once a year or 4 times a year, and you need to look at like 50 or 100 documents to do that. That's just not that expensive. If you're billing someone, $10, $20, $30,000 a year. Conversely, if you're working with a consumer app where we have millions of users, they're creating content tens of times a day, and you're not charging them directly, that's really expensive. And I don't think we know how we're going to actually support consumer scale usage yet. And certainly this might be self-hosting, maybe using Llama instead of using Anthropic or OpenAI. Who knows? I think we'll find out a lot more as we go. But even if you use like a self-hosted model, like there's still costs there. It's just they get to like hide the costs in a different budget line. You still have to pay for it. So where are we going to be able to actually do this on consumer grade that is affordable and makes sense? I don't think we know yet. And maybe it's small language models. We'll see what the future looks like. Finally, want to talk a little bit about how Carta has adopted LLMs. So like I said above, we started with the simplest possible LLM provider, one of the big 2 that you would know well. And we focused on building some simple development workflows for us to do evals, iterate quickly. Then we really focused on workflows. So iterating quickly is something that I care about a great deal. And if you design the rollout of LLMs the wrong way, you're not going to get quick iteration. And so the biggest thing for us that we thought about is how do we make sure that the product teams can create kind of the injection point for LLMs and machine learning. And then the machine learning engineers are decoupled to iterate on this repeatedly over time without having to have like a tight coupling between the 2. And so for all of our workflows, we really focused on this idea of bringing our documentation first, get docs as the first step of workflows rather than like a second or third or last step. And that means once we get the documentation first, there's still a bunch of forms to fill in, but then the LLMs can start filling in those forms selectively and more of those forms over time. And as our completionist, the comprehensiveness of the things that we extract gets higher and higher, you've moved into a review mode instead of a create input mode, while also having the ability to override, to customize as necessary for anything that you disagree with or want to go a different direction on. Doing this first also gives us like a great way to mask latency. So you might not have all 3 documents easily on hand, so you upload one document, you go search your email for another document, and all of a sudden we get like a couple of minutes to actually do the work to extract data behind the scenes. So by the time you actually click moving forward, after you get the last document in, we've been able to extract all the data, and it feels instant for you, even though it does take a little bit of time for us on the back end. We have 2 different ways that we think about doing human in the loop Carta, a bunch of different product lines, but the core product lines that we offer are we do fund administration. We actually will like operate your venture capital fund or private equity fund for you. Then we also do cap tables. And in both cases, we have like internal folks in the loop and also kind of like specialized folks at the customer or partnering with the customer that can help us. And so we have like some cases, like when you're inputting data, like you can actually review it. So you, the customer, could be the human in the loop in some cases. For example, your EIN for a tax form or something, like that's information you know quite well. Other cases are the fund controller working within Carta to support you in the operation of your fund the firm and funds that we're running for you. Might be the human in the loop, or we can extract the data and then they can review it to make sure it's accurate. Then in other cases, there's kind of these third parties. So we have the customer working with, but they also have like a law firm that they've retained who's helping run the cap table side of things for them. And so that paralegal working at the law firm is an amazing kind of human in the loop who can make sure that things are accurate. And we built some great tools that are making it life easier for the paralegals that we partner with. But also keeping them there to have like a close eye on it so they're able to review the work and have conviction that we're doing the right things with these models. Similarly to the paralegals on the fund administration side, often there'll be like an outsourced CFO. That's kind of the third party working with the fund, or outsourced CFO and Carta. And we can leverage them in the exact same way to make sure that we can build tools that make them more productive, make their jobs easier, but still keep them in the loop to review the work and make sure it's accurate to their standards and certainly to ours and the customers. Human in the loop is phenomenal, but there's also work cases when the problem to be solved is constrained enough that you don't have to have human in the loop. So we have human in the loop, but we can also just have like plain old like automation and software in the loop. And so this isn't using LLMs to check LLMs. This is just using health checks, probabilistic analysis, things like that, to understand like, is this like a reasonable value? Is this a typical value? How much conviction do we have that this value got pulled out? It's probably right. And so Carta Launch, basically, if you come to Carta and you're a small company, hasn't done a priced round like a Series A yet, we will give you a cap table for free, and we will let you use that for as long as you want until you raise your first priced round, essentially. And in that case, the big value prop is that these are people who have like a pretty simple cap table, super constrained problems, like not that complex. They don't have a ton of expertise with their cap table yet. So if they try to do something really complex, like they'll probably make an error versus us trying to do the best thing, like we are experts. And they might not have like a law firm retained yet who could help review with them. So in this case, the problem's simple enough, along with like the automation that we've built to do like kind of the software in the loop, to actually solve this problem without a human in the loop. Doesn't work for the larger ones that are more complex, but in this case, it does work. And also, this is another way to think about, instead of having human in the loop as like a workflow step, human in the loop can be kind of a moment in time. And in this case, the moment in time is like raising your first priced round. That's when the quality and accuracy of your cap table is extraordinarily important. And so even, if we don't do like the human in the loop each time you come through launch, because we're able to rely on the software in the loop, we can still do the human in the loop for validation before we move into a price round or something like that, to make sure that there's no kind of risk there for such like an important moment in a company's life cycle. Then, once we have the setup where the machine learning engineers can like iterate independently of the application engineers, we're kind of home free. So now the machine learning engineers have like a punch list of these different document types, these different workflows to kind of add support into. They already have like the workflow set up for them to come in and just start doing that. And they're just running through, they're just working through the punch list. And it's pretty remarkable. So now they don't have a ton of coordination costs working with their teams. And we've set them free to just work on this problem. And it's going pretty well. Then finally, for Carta, and certainly like different companies will think about this different ways. But we really aren't out there talking a lot about LLMs because I don't think our customers care about LLMs. Our customers care about productivity. Customers care about the quality and accuracy of their data. Companies care about if they initiate a cap call, they want that cap call kind of going out immediately. They want it to be done consistently to their LPA's rules around like how long they need to leave it open. That's what they care about. And so we don't go and talk to our customers about LLMs. Our customers care about the actual product, how it serves them, not about LLMs. And I think that's been like an important guiding light for us. Okay, 9 more quick opinions that I've labeled as corollaries, but really are just sort of opinions. First, there's people out there which is like software engineers are dead and we don't need this anymore. And yeah, they're definitely wrong. But I do think it's true that going from 0 to 1, these are like pretty powerful capabilities. You can get a lot further going 0 to 1 today with LLMs than you could have, like a couple years ago. And so, the great thing about 0 to 1 is don't have any customers, or very few, don't have any data or very little. You don't have like compliance obligations like SOC 2, like regulatory overhead, PCI, HIPAA, like just none of this stuff matters. And so when you don't have all these constraints going from 0 to 1, where it just like kind of works, that's enough. It's really, really not enough going from 1 to n. And I think people that believe LLMs are going to replace the 1 to n journey just don't understand the 1 to n journey. It's not my experience that these things are replaceable. Even thinking about like a highly performant SQL migration, I've seen engineers lock up Postgres for hours doing migrations that seemed like they should work because they just didn't pay enough attention to the details. And hey, you could argue like, hey, if engineers are making these mistakes, then it's okay if LLMs make these mistakes too. And sure, that's probably true, but this idea that it's going to be easy, that you can recover from that if you don't have like a database engineering team to help with that, I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical about that, but we'll find out. Hallucinations are a real problem, but they're a problem in a couple of ways. Like 1, it can damage the user experience, but 2, they can create like real legal liability for you. And so I think a lot of the problem around hallucinations, again, this is like a 0 to 1 versus 1 to n thing. Going from 0 to 1, there is no liability to manage because you don't own anything of value. Your company is effectively default dead. But as you get larger, liability starts to matter a great deal. And so I think any discussion about hallucinations, which is only about usability, but doesn't talk about liability, is missing a big part of the conversation. For things that matter from an accuracy perspective, human in the loop's the only solution at scale or in really constrained problems. Caveat, software in the loop can do like a good amount of validation as well using like non-LLM methodologies. Should you consider both strategic and opportunistic opportunities? If you think about how history is going to judge us, and history is going to judge all of us in various ways, but history is not going to say like you navigated the LLM transition by making CX a little bit cheaper to provide. History won't care about that. History is going to really judge us on our ability to do things that are net new, things that don't exist today, using LLM capabilities. And if you're only focused on kind of the opportunistic, kind of like making teams cheaper or making teams like n% more efficient, I don't know if that's quite the right thing to be focused on entirely. There's skepticism about whether models will continue to improve on one hand. And there's like kind of like this is the new Moore's law. They're going to keep getting generationally better every n months, every 18, 24 months. And I think we're way too early to really know. I think the safest bet here is that we'll keep pouring more money into it. So we'll keep getting more compute. There's still more data out there. But we'll see a lot of algorithmic improvements and optimizations that will allow us to keep getting improvements, even as like data sets and money on training large models. Like the latest models are costing like $500 million to $1 billion to train. But I think we'll still see improvements for at least a couple more generations. I think betting against that is pretty risky. RAG, context windows. Some of the new models have giant context windows, but are very slow. My expectation is in many cases, large context windows are a great way to do prototyping, but just too slow for production use cases. But I would recommend trying both. Many shot and few shot in context learning works surprisingly well. You basically give examples of the sorts of decisions you want it to make before you ask it to make a similar decision. worth playing around with that if you haven't already. There's sort of like a belief that maybe machine learning engineers are going away. We don't need them anymore, and I found that extremely untrue. The core techniques around thinking about data accuracy, data cleaning, etc., I think incredibly important. If anyone tells you it's not, you should be questionable. You should question them. And then finally, I've said this kind of every section, but what really matters is starting to build your intuition. Start where it's easy. Start probably with your existing models provided by your cloud provider, and then iterate from there. Don't overthink it. All right, and that's what I got. I'm Will Larson, and I appreciate you listening to me.